Officer Jake Miller wasn't the kind of man to let go. He had been a cop for 10 years, rising through the ranks with a reputation for being relentless. Whether it was chasing down criminals or fighting for love, Jake never knew when to stop. The problem was, Rachel did. Rachel Carter had once been the love of his life. They met during his patrol days in downtown Chicago. She was a nurse, kind-hearted and full of life. They had shared 2 years together, but their relationship was anything but perfect. Jake was possessive, controlling, and increasingly unstable. When Rachel finally had enough and walked away, he swore he would do whatever it took to get her back. But Rachel never looked back. She moved on, started seeing someone new, and made it clear to Jake that their love story was over. That's when his obsession turned dangerous. The night Rachel died was like any other cold winter evening in Chicago. Snow had started to fall, covering the streets in a thin white sheet. The city lights flickered against the glass windows of her apartment as she prepared for a quiet night in. She had no idea that someone was watching from the shadows. By the time the neighbors heard the screams, it was already too late. The crime scene at Rachel Carter's apartment was nothing short of brutal. Blood smeared across the white marble floor, her body sprawled lifeless near the kitchen island. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, lay beside her, its handle wiped clean. Detective Robert Callahan, a veteran in homicide investigations, stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. He had seen his fair share of crime scenes, but this one was personal. Rachel wasn't just another victim. She was the ex-girlfriend of a cop. As he stepped inside, he noted the forced entry, the scattered belongings, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Whoever did this wanted Rachel dead, but more than that, they wanted to make her suffer. "Looks like a crime of passion," Callahan muttered, glancing at the responding officers. "Where's her boyfriend?" "Neighbor says she was dating a guy named Kevin Daniels," Officer Reed replied. "Software engineer. We have him at the station for questioning." Callahan nodded but felt a strange unease. He had worked enough cases to know when something didn't add up. And this felt too neat, too staged. A framed photograph of Rachel caught his attention. It was cracked from the scuffle, but beneath the shattered glass was a familiar face standing beside her. Officer Jake Miller. Callahan narrowed his eyes. Something told him this case was just getting started. Detective Robert Callahan sat across from Kevin Daniels in the dimly lit interrogation room. The young man looked exhausted. His hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow. His dark brown eyes were swollen, his face pale. He hadn't slept since he got the news. Rachel Carter was dead. Callahan had seen men like Kevin before, the kind who weren't built for violence. He was nervous, but not the way a guilty man would be. He wasn't shifting in his seat or avoiding eye contact. He was simply devastated. "Kevin," Callahan started, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me about the last time you saw Rachel." Kevin exhaled slowly. "It was the night before this happened. I dropped her off at her apartment around 9 p.m. We had dinner, nothing unusual. She was happy." "Happy?" Callahan raised a brow. "Yes." Kevin's voice cracked. "She told me she was finally ready to move forward. She even mentioned wanting to introduce me to her family soon." Callahan made a note of that. If Rachel had been looking forward to a future with Kevin, then her murder wasn't a random break-in. Someone had wanted to stop her from moving on. Did she ever mention feeling unsafe? Maybe someone was following her. Kevin hesitated. She did say something weird last week." "What was it?" "She thought she saw her ex outside her hospital." Callahan's grip on his pen tightened. "Her ex?" "Yeah, Jake Miller, the cop. A familiar name. Callahan had worked with Jake before, years ago. He was a good officer, but intense. The kind of guy who got too attached to things and people." "Did she confront him?" Kevin shook his head. She wasn't sure if it was really him. And honestly, she didn't want to believe it. But she was scared, Detective. She changed her routine, started double-checking her locks at night. Callahan leaned back in his chair. Rachel had feared something, or rather someone. He had enough experience to know that when a woman starts looking over her shoulder, there's a reason. Kevin wasn't his guy. "Where were you last night?" Callahan asked. "I was home. Alone." Callahan frowned. An alibi with no witnesses. That wouldn't help Kevin's case, even if he was innocent. All right, Kevin. For now, you're free to go. But don't leave town. Kevin nodded, his face filled with sorrow. Detective, please find out who did this. Callahan sighed. I intend to. As Kevin left, Callahan's mind raced. If Rachel had been afraid of Jake Miller, then he had to pay him a visit. Something told him this case was about to take a dark turn. Detective Robert Callahan pulled into the parking lot of the 21st Precinct, where Officer Jake Miller was stationed. The building loomed under the gray Chicago sky, a cold reminder that even those sworn to protect could have secrets. Inside, officers bustled around, answering calls, filing reports, and handling the city's endless stream of crime. Callahan walked past them, his years in law enforcement making him invisible in the sea of badges. At his desk, Jake Miller looked up from his paperwork. He was built like an athlete, broad shoulders, strong jaw, piercing blue eyes. But there was something else about him, something that had always set Callahan on edge. He was too controlled, too calculated. Detective, Jake said, forcing a smile. What brings you here? Callahan didn't bother with pleasantries. Rachel Carter. For a split second, a flicker of something crossed Jake's face. Then it was gone. I heard, he said, shaking his head. It's awful. You two dated, didn't you? Jake's smile tightened. A long time ago. When was the last time you saw her? Jake leaned back, folding his arms. Maybe 6 months ago. We ran into each other downtown. Talked for a few minutes. That's it. Callahan watched him carefully. She thought she saw you outside her hospital last week. Jake frowned. She was mistaken. She was scared, Jake. At that, something shifted in his expression. His jaw clenched. Rachel and I had our problems, Jake said, his voice cool. But I would never hurt her. You sure about that? Callahan asked. Jake's hands balled into fists. You accusing me of something, detective? Callahan held his gaze. Not yet, but I have to ask. Where were you last night? Jake leaned forward. At home. Alone. Another alibi with no witnesses. Convenient. Callahan took a deep breath. Look, Jake, if you know anything, now's the time to tell me. Jake's eyes darkened. I don't know anything. Callahan studied him for a long moment, then stood. I'll be in touch. As he walked away, his instincts screamed at him. Jake Miller wasn't telling the whole truth, and Callahan was going to find out why. Detective Robert Callahan sat at his desk, staring at the whiteboard where he had mapped out the case. Rachel Carter's name was in bold at the center, her picture pinned beside it. Arrows connected her to the two men in her life, Kevin Daniels, the grieving boyfriend, and Jake Miller, the ex-cop with something to hide. So far, neither man had a solid alibi, but Callahan trusted his gut. Kevin was heartbroken, but Jake was something else. There was an edge to him, a tension beneath his words that didn't sit right. Callahan decided it was time to dig deeper. Rachel's apartment complex had security cameras, but the footage from the night of her murder hadn't been reviewed yet. Callahan and Officer Reed drove to the building, where the property manager, Mr. Hendricks, met them. Terrible thing what happened to that young lady, Hendricks muttered as he led them to the security office. He sat at a desk, scrolling through the footage. We keep a week's worth of recordings. Here's last night's. The footage played. 7 p.m. Rachel arrived home alone. 9 p.m. The hallways were quiet. 10 p.m. Still nothing. Then at 10:37 p.m., movement. A man in dark clothing entered the building. He wore a hoodie pulled low over his face, but the build was familiar. He moved with purpose, taking the back stairwell instead of the elevator. Callahan leaned closer. Pause that. Hendricks stopped the video. The man turned slightly before disappearing up the stairs. The footage was grainy, but Callahan could see enough. The figure had the same build as Jake Miller. His stomach tightened. Can you zoom in on his face? Callahan asked. Hendricks tried, but the quality was too poor. Callahan turned to Reed. We need to check Jake's movements last night. GPS, traffic cams, anything. Reed nodded. I'm on it. They had a lead. Now they just needed proof. Back at the precinct, Callahan ran a background check on Jake's cell phone records. What he found made his pulse quicken. Jake's phone had pinged near Rachel's apartment at 10:45 p.m. If he was home alone like he claimed, why was his phone near the crime scene? Callahan leaned back in his chair. He had enough to bring Jake in for real questioning. Something told him this case was about to break wide open. Detective Robert Callahan stood outside Interrogation Room 3, watching through the two-way mirror. Inside, Jake Miller sat at the metal table, arms crossed, face unreadable. His expression was cool, but Callahan knew better. Behind that calm exterior, something dangerous lurked. Beside Callahan, Officer Reed shifted. "You sure he's our guy?" Callahan nodded. His phone pinged near Rachel's apartment at the time of the murder. "We also have security footage of a man matching his build entering the building. He lied about being home." Reed exhaled. "Damn." Callahan straightened his tie. Time to see what he has to say. Callahan walked in, setting a case file on the table. Jake's sharp blue eyes followed his every move. "Detective," Jake greeted with a smirk. "I assume I'm here as a witness?" Callahan didn't return the smile. He flipped open the file, revealing a still image from the security footage. The hooded figure, the timestamp. He slid it across the table. "This is you, isn't it?" Callahan's voice was steady. Jake barely glanced at the image. "Can't say. Hard to tell from that angle." Callahan leaned forward. "Your phone pinged near Rachel's apartment around the same time this footage was taken. So I'll ask again, where were you last night?" Jake's jaw tightened. "At home." Callahan let the silence stretch between them. Then he pulled out a second piece of evidence, a printed report of Jake's call logs. "You called Rachel 3 times the night she died." No answer. "What did you want?" Jake didn't blink. "To talk. About what?" Jake's fingers drummed against the table. "Closure." Callahan's stomach twisted. He had seen this before. The obsessive ex who couldn't let go. The man who convinced himself that if he couldn't have her, no one else would. "She didn't want to talk to you, Jake," Callahan said quietly. "She was moving on. That made you angry, didn't it?" Jake's smirk vanished. His shoulders stiffened. "You were seen at her hospital last week," Callahan continued. "Rachel was scared. She was changing her routine, locking her doors, looking over her shoulder. She knew you were watching her." Jake exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous." "No, Jake. What's ridiculous is you thinking we wouldn't put it together." Callahan pulled out one final piece of evidence, a blurry but enhanced still of the hooded man entering Rachel's building. "This is you. You followed her home. You broke in. And then, when she fought back, you killed her." Jake's fingers curled into fists. His breathing grew heavier. "You don't know what you're talking about," he hissed. Callahan sat back, his voice calm but firm. "I think I do." Silence. Then Jake's lips parted in a slow, humorless laugh. "You don't have proof," he murmured. But Callahan wasn't finished yet. "We found your prints on her kitchen counter." He let the words sink in. "She fought, Jake. She scratched you." Jake instinctively touched his wrist, where a faint scratch remained. Callahan didn't miss it. "Rachel didn't die easily," Callahan said. "She fought for her life." Jake's breath hitched, his composure cracking. And then his mask fell. His hand slammed the table. "She shouldn't have left me," he roared. "She was mine." Silence. The confession hung in the air. Callahan exhaled, his work finally done. Jake Miller wasn't just obsessed, he was a murderer. Detective Robert Callahan watched Jake Miller, who now sat slumped in his chair, his outburst still echoing in the interrogation room. The moment of weakness had exposed everything, but Callahan knew better than to celebrate early. He needed airtight evidence. A confession alone wasn't always enough. Jake's eyes were wild now, his mask of control completely shattered. He had tried to keep up the act, but deep down, he was unraveling. "You don't get it, Callahan," Jake muttered, his voice low. "Rachel and I had something real." Callahan shook his head. "She didn't think so." Jake's jaw tightened. "You followed her," Callahan continued. "You called her 3 times the night she died. When she didn't answer, you went to her apartment." Jake said nothing. "You used your police training to get inside without making a scene. Maybe you knocked. Maybe you had a key she never knew about. But when she saw you, she wasn't happy to see you, was she?" Jake's fingers twitched. She tried to make you leave. She told you it was over for good, and you couldn't handle that. Callahan's voice was steady, but every word hit like a hammer. Jake let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. You think you're so damn smart. I don't have to be smart, Callahan said. I just have to follow the evidence. And right now, all of it points to you. Jake's silence was enough. Callahan pushed back his chair. We're done here. As he left the room, he nodded to Officer Reed. Get the forensic report. I want every piece of DNA we found in that apartment tested. Reed nodded. If his prints are on that counter, we might find more. Callahan's gut told him they would. The next morning, Callahan sat at his desk, sipping black coffee as he flipped through the forensic results. The report confirmed what he already knew. Jake Miller had been in Rachel's apartment that night. His fingerprints were on the kitchen counter. A partial footprint matched the tread of his department-issued boots. And then, the final nail in the coffin, DNA from the skin under Rachel's fingernails. She had fought back. Callahan closed the file. This was it. He picked up the phone and called the district attorney's office. We're filing charges against Officer Jake Miller for the murder of Rachel Carter. There was no more doubt. Justice was coming. Detective Robert Callahan stood in the courtroom, watching as Jake Miller was led to the defense table in handcuffs. The once proud officer now looked small, his sharp blue eyes dull, his hands trembling slightly. The case had moved fast. With Jake's outburst in the interrogation room, the forensic evidence, and the security footage, the prosecution had everything they needed. The district attorney had charged Jake with first-degree murder, and the trial had drawn citywide attention. Rachel Carter had been a respected nurse, a woman with a bright future. Her murder was a tragedy that the public wouldn't forget, and now the man responsible was finally facing justice. The courtroom was packed. Rachel's family in the front row, her mother clutching a tissue, her father's jaw clenched tight. Kevin Daniels, Rachel's boyfriend, sat beside them, staring at Jake with barely contained rage. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the evidence piece by piece. Jake's phone records showing he had been near Rachel's apartment at the time of her murder. The security footage of a man with Jake's build sneaking into the building, fingerprints on the counter, a footprint on the floor, and Rachel's DNA under Jake's fingernails. Each fact was like another nail in Jake's coffin. When the prosecution played Jake's interrogation tape, the courtroom fell silent. You don't have proof, Jake had said, but then his rage had slipped. She shouldn't have left me. She was mine. Rachel's mother let out a muffled sob. The jury watched Jake closely, seeing what Callahan had seen in that room, a man who had let his obsession turn into violence. It took the jury less than 4 hours. When they returned, the judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Everyone held their breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Miller, guilty of first-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the room. Rachel's mother wept, clutching her husband's arm. Kevin Daniels closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. Jake Miller didn't move. He stared straight ahead, his face blank. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Jake Miller, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." It was over. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, Callahan stood under the Chicago sky, watching as Rachel's family embraced. There was no happiness in their faces, only relief and sorrow. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. "Detective Callahan, do you have a statement on today's verdict?" Callahan adjusted his coat. Rachel Carter deserved justice. Today she got it. He walked away, letting the city swallow him up. Cases like this never really left a detective's mind. But as Callahan disappeared into the evening crowd, he knew one thing. Rachel Carter's story was finally over, and Jake Miller would never hurt another woman again.